والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعد نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن اقتفى أثره واستنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما إلى علمنا ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. Inshallah, we'll continue with reading from the book known as Alfiyah al-Iraaqi or at-Tabsirah at-Tadhkirah في علم الحديث للإمام أبي الفضل زين الدين عبد الرحيم بن الحسين al-Iraaqi rahimahullah ta'ala, who died in the year 806 after the Hijrah. The book at-Tabsirah at-Tadhkirah, or that which gives insight as well as a reminder regarding the science of Hadith, that was authored by Zain al-Din Abu al-Fadl Abdul Rahim ibn Hussein al-Iraaqi rahimahullah ta'ala, who died in the year 836. And we've covered the author's introduction rahimahullah ta'ala. So today we'll start with the first chapter that the author mentions, or that the poet mentions from the chapters of Ibn Salah, which is Aqsam al-Hadith. Aqsam al-Hadith. And so as always, let's listen to the poem, the portion of this chapter that we'll be covering today. And we probably won't cover the entirety of this chapter, but just the first half of it. And so
أقسام الحديث.
وأهل هذا الشأن قسموا السنن إلى صحيح وضعيف وحسن. فالأول المتصل الإسناد بنقل عدل ضابط الفؤاد عن مثله من غير ما شذوذ وعلة قادحة فتوذ. وبالصحيح والضعيف قصدوا في ظاهر لا القطع والمعتمد.
Now, and so we'll suffice ourselves with that amount for this lesson, inshallah. I don't think we'll get to cover much more than that. طيب. نعم. So that is the section. وأهل هذا الشأن قسموا السنن إلى صحيح وضعيف وحسن. فالأول المتصل الإسناد بنقل عدل ضابط الفؤاد عن مثله من غير ما شذوذ وعلة قادحة فتوذ. وبالصحيح والضعيف قصدوا في ظاهر لا القطع والمعتمد. One more time. وأهل هذا الشأن قسموا السنن إلى صحيح وضعيف وحسن. فالأول المتصل الإسناد بنقل عدل ضابط الفؤاد عن مثله من غير ما شذوذ وعلة قادحة فتوذ. وبالصحيح والضعيف قصدوا في ظاهر لا القطع والمعتمد. One last time. وأهل هذا الشأن قسموا السنن إلى صحيح وضعيف وحسن. فالأول المتصل الإسناد بنقل عدل ضابط الفؤاد عن مثله من غير ما شذوذ وعلة قادحة فتوذي. وبالصحيح والضعيف قصدوا في ظاهر لا القطع والمعتمد. طيب. A quick translation. وأهل هذا الشأن. وأهل, those who are the most entitled, the family, the people of this field, of this affair. وأهل هذا الشأن, the people who are most entitled to this matter, the scholars of Hadith. قسموا السنن, they have divided the sunan, we'll talk about it, inshallah, the statements of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, وأقواله وأفعاله وتقريراته. إلى صحيح وضعيف وحسن, they have divided or categorized the sunan to that which is Sahih, Da'if, and Hasan. فالأول المتصل الإسنادي. So the first of those categories, the first of them, is the one whose chain is connected. متصل, connected, الإسناد, chain. بنقل عدل ضابط الفؤاد. The first of them is the one who has a connected chain in its via the transmission of righteous and precise people. And or the first of them is that which has a connected chain via the transmission of righteous and those with precision in their intellect. And مثله من غير ما شذوذ, transmitting one of them on someone similar to themselves without there being any shudud or contradiction. وعلة قادحة فتوذي, or subtle defects, or should we even not even say subtle, or defects that cause damage to the narration and thus are problematic or annoying or problematic. وبالصحيح والضعيف قصدوا, and what they intend by saying something is sahih or da'if, right? And when it comes to something being sahih or da'if, their intention is fi zahirin lil qat', is what is apparent of that matter, not what is certain. Wal mu'tamadu, that's that word al mu'tamadu goes with the next line of poetry. So that's a quick translation. Wa ahlu hadha ash-sha'ni qassamu sunan. The people of this matter, they have divided the sunan into that which is sahih, as well as da'if, as well as hasan. فالأول المتصل الإسنادي بنقل عدل ضابط الفؤاد. So the first of those categories is that which has a connected chain via the transmission of righteous people with precise intellects. And مثله من غير ما شذوذ, narrating on others similar to themselves without there being any contradictions. وعلة قادحة فتوذي, or defects that harm the narration and thus cause a problem. وبالصحيح والضعيف قصدوا في ظاهر للقط والمعتمد. And as it relates to something being sahih or da'if, not lines. Let's see how a sheikh Badr al-Ammash, let's see how he wrote a quick translation of the poem itself, along with a reading of the prose, and then a slight explanation of the lines that are covered. So Badr al-Ammash حفظه ta'ala, he says, يقول راجي ربه المقتدر. لا, we read that already. He says, قسم أهل الحديث السنن إلى ثلاثة أقسام: الصحيح وحسن وضعيف. فالأول الصحيح متصل إسناده بنقل العدل الضابط عن مثله من غير شذوذ ولا علة قادحة. وإذا قال المحدث حديث صحيح أو قال حديث ضعيف فمراده ظاهر فمراده فيما ظهر له عملا بظاهر الإسناد لتوفر الشروط أو عدم بعضها، لا القطع بذلك في نفس الأمر لجواز الخطأ والنسيان عن الثقة أو على الثقة وجواز الضبط على الضعيف. طيب. He says the people of Hadith have categorized the Sunan into three categories. The first of them is Sahih, and then Hasan, and then Da'if. As far as the first, which is Sahih, then it is what has a connected chain via the transmission of righteous and reliable individuals, narrating on others similar to themselves, without there being any contradiction or damaging defects. And when a person or a scholar of hadith says that this hadith is sahih, or they say that this hadith is da'if, then their intention by that is as it relates to what is apparent to them, acting according to what is obvious and apparent from the chain, due to the presence of the conditions that are necessary or the lack of some of them. And they do not intend by their statement certainty or absoluteness regarding this matter. And this is due to the possibility or the possibility of a mistake or forgetfulness from a righteous person, a righteous and reliable person, as well as the possibility of precision from an unreliable person. So that's what these lines mean in a nutshell. طيب. أقسام الحديث. أقسام. جمع القسم. And al-qism in Arabic, one of the things that I found very enjoyable is the way that Arabic has a way of defining and breaking things down. And so you find that a lot of times there are synonyms, but there's always a difference between a word and its synonym. And so a lot of times you'll see people say that a qism is a type. And the word for that in Arabic that they usually translate it to is a naw', right? But a naw' is one type of a thing, right? While a qism, there are two ways to explain categorization. Talk about categories of something, a qism. There are two types of aqsam. There is taqsim al-kull ila juz'iyatihi, dividing a whole into its parts. So if you have something that is a whole, when you divide it into its parts, those parts equaling the whole, then that is taqsim. That is the first type of division of a category or categorization, is to divide a whole into its parts. Like, for example, if you have a whole pizza, or let's take a better example. If you have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, peanut butter is a category, jelly is a category, bread is a category. Each one of those things by itself is not peanut butter and jelly. But when you put them all together, they become peanut butter and jelly. So this is dividing a whole into its parts. And this is one type of division, to divide a whole into its parts. Al-kull ila ajza'ihi. Or al-kulliya ila juz'iyatihi, should we say. Al-kulliya ila juz'iyatihi. To divide a whole into its parts. The second type of division or categorization is to divide or to categorize a entirety into its individuals. And what we mean by that, an entirety, for example, humanity. That is an entirety, that is a kull. right? That is an entire group. And you divide and categorize that group into its individuals. So males are humans, females are humans, boys are humans, girls are humans, old people are humans, young people are humans. And so it doesn't take a male and a female to make the entirety. Instead, every single one of those things is part of or one manifestation of the entirety. Taqsim al-kull ila afradihi. To divide an entirety into its individuals. And so there's a difference between it and the first one. So every human is a human, while peanut butter, jelly, and bread individually don't make up peanut butter and jelly. So all of that being said, the type of division that the author is intending here is the second type, dividing an entirety into its individual members. And what are we dividing, or what are we categorizing the individual members of? What categories are we making? We are making the categories of hadith. And this term, or this meaning of a taqsim or categorization, is that which is similar to it being a type. And so that's why they say the types of hadith, or aqsam al-hadith, the separate individual classifications and categories of hadith. As far as al-hadith, then as we've learned, the word hadith linguistically, it is the opposite of that which is old. So something that is new, they call it hadith. And it was used to express speech, generally speaking, in the Arabic language, because speech comes one thing at a time. And so since speech is constantly renewing and coming one after another, they called it hadith. And it's a synonym to the word kalam. And because when the statements of the Prophet ﷺ became one of the cornerstones of the religion, it was used to represent the Prophet's legislation or the Prophet's sunnah more dominantly amongst the Arabs, amongst the Arabic speaking people. And so it went from having its original meaning to its cultural meaning to its religious meaning. Originally, it means to be new. And then culturally, colloquially, it became speech. And then religiously, it became a synonym to the sunnah. And what it means, the word hadith in the religion, is the statements of the Prophet ﷺ and his actions and his allowances, as well as what he was described with physically, or his etiquette and his morals and his character. All of these are hadith. And for that reason, it could simply be said, ma udhifa ila nabi. Anything attributed to the Prophet ﷺ could be called a hadith. You could attribute a statement to him, hadith. You could attribute an action to him, hadith. You could attribute something that he allowed in his presence, hadith. You could attribute a physical quality to him, hadith. And you could attribute a non-physical quality, a characteristic, right? A manner, an etiquette to him, hadith. Anything that is attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, then we call this a hadith. Ma udhifa ila nabi. And so we're going to categorize the different types of hadith. So this first section is aqsam al-ahadith, or aqsam al-hadith. And it should be known that dividing or categorizing hadith There are four major ways to categorize hadith. You can categorize hadith in the way that it reached us. How did that hadith reach us? Did it reach us in an undeniable way, what we call mutawatir, its chain being undeniable? Or did it reach us in a way that requires research and study to establish its validity? So if it reached us in an undeniable way, then we call this mutawatir. The hadith is mutawatir. It's undeniable. It's something that doesn't necessarily require us to even study the chain anymore, because the information has reached us from one individual after another in an amount and in a way that it is unlikely or impossible that they could have all colluded to come up with a lie. Similar to how, for example, most of us have never seen Alaska. We don't have physical experience with Alaska, for example, or the North Pole. Let's use the North Pole. Most of us have never seen or have any physical experience with the North Pole. So how do we know it's there? Because the amount of people who have told us about it from different walks of life and from different generations and different nationalities and languages and so forth have told us about it in a way that it is impossible that they could have colluded to come up with a lie regarding it. And so if somebody denies the existence of the North Pole, we would consider this person foolish. We would say this person is a fool. How can you deny the North Pole? Everybody knows the North Pole exists. Even though the majority of us have never been there, we've never seen it, we've never experienced it, because the information regarding it is mutawatir. It's undeniable in the way that that information reached us. And because it's undeniable, there's no longer a need to study the chain of narrators and how that information reached us. The other way that it could have reached us would be what they call ahad, non-mutawatir, i.e., it hasn't reached a level that is undeniable. It requires further study to determine its authenticity or lack thereof. And we'll come across the categories of this, mashhur and aziz and gharib. We'll come across those types at their suitable locations in the poem. But the reality, as we're going to talk about later as well, is that a hadith being mutawatir or ahad, it doesn't really exist from the foundations of the science of hadith. The people of hadith classically weren't concerned with, is a narration mutawatir or ahad. And some of them have even gone as far as to say that this type of classification was done by the enemies of hadith to give them a means to reject certain types of hadith. So you find that some of the people of rhetoric and philosophy and theology, they reject the acceptance of hadith that are ahad, that aren't mutawatir, in matters like aqidah, for example. And they say, well, we can't base our aqidah on something that we don't have certainty regarding. And since these ahadith are possible that they could have been mistaken, or, you know, when we look into them, there's there could be a flaw, or maybe somebody forgot, we can't base our aqidah on this. But the reality is that the situation is other than that. The people of Islam and the people of hadith specifically have not ceased to accept information from hadith regardless of how it reached them. as long as it was reliable. And so this first method of categorizing hadith, even though it's included in the books of hadith a lot nowadays and in the later generations, early on and classically, it wasn't part of the science of hadith, categorizing hadith to what is mutawatir or ahad. The second way of categorizing hadith is categorizing hadith as it relates to the connectivity of the chain. If we're going to study the chain, and the chain needs to be learned and researched because it's not mutawatir, then we need to categorize hadith as it relates to the connectivity of that chain. Is the chain connected or is it disconnected? A connected chain or a disconnected chain? And if the chain is disconnected, how is its disconnection? Is it something that is obvious? Or is it something that is less than obvious? Is it something that is disconnected at its beginning, in its middle, or in its end? Is it something that has only one missing spot, or are there multiple missing spots? And so all of these type of hadith, all of these type of categories, we will study in the science of hadith, the connectivity of the chain. The third way to categorize hadith is to categorize hadith based on where the information is being attributed to, or who the information is being attributed to. Is it being attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? And so therefore it's a hadith in all senses of the word, regardless of its connectivity or how it reached us. It's still a hadith because it's being attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Or is it being attributed to someone else, and therefore is only a hadith in the loose sense of the word, right? Not necessarily a hadith in the actual sense of the word, but because we also study it in this field, we include it amongst the sciences of hadith. Like, does the information get attributed to a companion, and therefore it's not a hadith? Or is the statement of the companion a hadith? And we'll talk about that. Is the information attributed to a tabi'i, and therefore not a hadith? But what about if now? Or is the information attributed to someone lesser than the tabi'in, and so therefore not a hadith? And so we'll study in the categories of hadith and the types of hadith, who is the information being attributed to. So these first three, how the information reached us, the connectivity of the chain, and who the information is being attributed to, these are different ways to categorize hadith. But the most important way to categorize hadith, and it's the way that is more necessary to understand than all of these other categorizations, is to categorize a hadith into acceptability or lack thereof. Is the hadith valid or invalid or fabricated? And so this is the type of categorization that the author is referring to in this first section of the book. And it deserves to be the first, right? We noticed, we mentioned like how Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, he reorganized the field of hadith or the science of hadith, and he begins with how the hadith reached us. But even more important than all of the other types of categorizations is I need to understand what are the types of hadith as it relates to acceptability or lack thereof. And so even though Ibn al-Salah didn't necessarily organize his book in the best way, because he was just dictating the information, and he would gather some information and then dictate it to his students, and like this the book was compiled. we see that him starting with the categorization of hadith as it relates to acceptability is a great place to begin. And so he says, wa ahlu hadha sha'n, the people of this field. And as we mentioned before, the only ones that we're worried about in the science of hadith are the people of hadith. Yes, you'll find us referencing the usuliyun, the people of usul al-fiqh, for example. You'll find that the people of hadith in the later generations started to include their statements in the field of hadith. And those statements that they include specifically deal with things that reason can be used to reach an answer. But the reality of it is that this field, like any other field, we should care about those who are specialists in this field and what they say, more than, if at all, the opinions of people who aren't from this discipline. And, that's natural. When we look at medicine, not only do we want a doctor, we want the doctor that is a specialist in our ailment. So if I have a foot injury, I don't want a brain surgeon. In spite of how intelligent he may be, this is not what he does. And that's without even considering the fact that I don't want a butcher, or I don't want a veterinarian, or I don't want a mechanic. All of them deal with something similar to medicine. Butchers know how to cut and do what could be considered surgery. Veterinarians know how to do medicine on animals other than human beings, and mechanics know how to repair machines. But I don't want any of them when I have a foot injury. And so if we not only want a doctor who's a specialist as it relates to our body, we don't want a specialist in the fundamentals of the usul al-fiqh, the fundamentals in understanding, or a linguist, the scholars of language, or even the scholars of Quran. We're not super impressed, or not impressed. We're not extremely concerned with what they have to say about this field, because this field is the science of hadith. And so he says, wa ahlu hadha sha'n, the people of this field have divided or have categorized the sunan. And the sunan is the plural of the word sunnah, which linguistically means path, tariqah. And it's been used to refer to the way of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as it relates to his statements, his actions, and his allowances, and his description. And thus it's another term for hadith. This is how the people of hadith use it when they're referring to it generally. They might also use it at times to refer to the legislative narrations, the legislative hadith, the halal and the haram. Like when you talk about a book known as a sunan, like Sunan Abi Dawood, it's the hadith that specifically deal with halal and haram. They might also use it to refer to aqidah, like when you talk about a sunnah, or usul as-sunnah, or kitab as-sunnah, right? They might be referring to aqidah and minhaj. But generally speaking, when the people of hadith refer to sunnah, they're talking about that which is a synonym of hadith, what the Prophet said, did, allowed, and was described with. And this is contrary to the people of fiqh. The people of fiqh, when they say sunnah, they mean a synonym to the word mustahab, or that which the legislation has commanded us to do in a non-binding fashion. The one who does it gets rewarded, and the one who doesn't, there's no punishment or sin. But the people of this field, the field of hadith, they have divided the sunan, i.e. the hadith, into that which is sahih, da'if, and hasan. Here, the first thing we should know is that the first person to actually state this thulathi classification was Abu Sulaiman al-Khattabi. Abu Sulaiman al-Khattabi. He is the first one to mention that hadith are classified into three categories: Sahih, Da'if, and Hasan. Yes, other people before him mentioned hadith being Hasan, like at-Tirmidhi, who was famous for that. But the first person to mention the classification of hadith and their acceptability and totality into three groups was Abu Sulaiman al-Khattabi rahimahullah ta'ala, I think in his book Ma'alim as-Sunan. And al-Khattabi, he has an explanation of Bukhari, and he also has an explanation of Sunan Abi Dawud. And he died in the year 360, if I'm not mistaken, or 360 something, and sometime in the 4th century. And so you see, it was very early on. Because if not, then there are many terminologies that the people used to use to categorize hadith as it relates to their acceptability. You had Sahih, Da'if, Hasan, Jade, Salih, right? These are all terms that people to use to categorize hadith as it relates to their acceptability. But the later generations, like we talked about al-Khattabi and so on, they made the classification or the categorization into just three groups. And this type of categorization is what they call istiqra'i. It's a categorization that, although some people might add and some people might subtract, when you study the issue and follow up all of the various strands, you'll find out that this categorization, there's no other way to categorize it. And this is because a hadith will either be acceptable or rejected, or acceptable or rejected. And if the hadith is acceptable, then it will be one of two categories: and the highest levels of acceptability, or something lesser than that, but above being rejected. And so when we look at that, we see that the categorization of hadith is in one of three things: the highest levels of acceptability, which are sahih; that which is lesser than the highest levels of acceptability, which is hasan; and that which is not acceptable, which is da'if. And so therefore, there's only three ways to categorize hadith. And so although people have used other terms, like we said, salih and jade and other things, to when talking about a hadith and its acceptability, these three terms have been that which the later generations have all adopted in their classification of hadith, until the extent that you don't really find anybody using anything other than it during these times. طيب. The author, he says, the people of this matter, or this field, this discipline, have categorized the sunnah into sahih, da'if, and hasan. Some people criticize Ibn Salah, or should I say al-Iraaqi. Some people criticize al-Iraaqi for mentioning da'if before hasan in this line of the poem, while the organization of the book would suggest that you would mention sahih and then hasan and then da'if. And so you would start with the highest to the lowest, and like this, the chapters of the book follow that organization, starting with the highest level and ending with the lowest in this categorization. While others, they make the excuse for Iraaqi and say, well, he did so for the sake of the poem, so that the poem could rhyme and fit the scale. While others come and they say, no, he could have just reworded it. And they mention, different various ways that he could have worded it. I say, and not just me, I've taken this from other people, the reality of it is that his organization of the hadith into sahih, da'if, and hasan, in my opinion, is the best way to organize it. And this is for two reasons. The first of them is to establish the complete the complete, yani the munasaba or munasaba, the suitability between sahih and da'if, at-taqsim, right? They're opposites of each other. So it's better to mention the opposites against each other. And even though you could say, well, it's the same mentioning highest to lowest, could be the same as mentioning the opposites together with each other, and then that which is in between. But even more important than that, as we'll learn, a Hasan Hadith is a type of Hadith that is sometimes Sahih by itself and sometimes Da'if by itself. Meaning a Hasan Hadith exists in a place that is between being acceptable by itself and being rejected by itself. And because this Hadith, the Hasan Hadith, exists in a place where it's sometimes part of being Sahih and sometimes part of being Da'if, as we'll learn when we get to the definition of Hasan, it made sense to mention it after knowing what is Sahih and what is Da'if, to understand that Hasan exists in between the two. And so, even though people can argue about what's the best way to organize, these are just things that can help you remember the line of poetry as well. He didn't go in order from greatest to least, but instead he did the opposites first. And the secret, or a secret benefit in that, is that Hasan is sometimes Sahih by itself and sometimes Da'if by itself. So أهل هذا الشأن قسموا السنن إلى صحيح وضعيف وحسن. That's the intro to the things that we're about to study. Then he begins the first category, which is as-Sahih. He doesn't give it its own chapter like he does for Hasan and Da'if, because it's what he spends the most of the time of this chapter speaking about. So even though the name of this chapter is the categories of Hadith in general, you can also remember that in that chapter he talks about specifically in detail a Hadith that is Sahih. And so he says, فَالْأَوَّلُ الْمُتَّصِلُ الْإِسْنَادِ. The first of them, the first of these three categories, is that which has a isnad that is muttasil. It has a chain that is connected. And for the benefit here, a person might be looking at the words and the grammar of those words. If you're studying grammar and you see al-awwal mubtada marfu' alamatu raf'ihi dhamma. It's the subject and it is in a state of raf with a dhamma. And it's also the possessed in a possessive phrase. I'm sorry. It's the mubtada. That's it. Fal-awwalu is the mubtada. And then the word al-muttasil is the khabar. Fal-awwalu al-muttasil. That's the khabar. It's marfu as well with the dhamma. But then you notice the word after it, al-isnadi. And a person who's studying grammar might be confused. Why is this word al-isnad with a kasrah? The word muttasil is mudaf. And the word al-isnad is mudaf ilay. It's a possessive phrase. But many of us, when we're learning the possessive phrase, the idafa early on, we learn that the possessed in the possessive phrase should not have alif and lam or tanween. But this is only the case when the possession, what is intended by it, is the true meaning of possession. But if what is intended by it is just the verbal possession, not an actual possessing, then the mudaf can have alif and lam. It can have tanween. And that is an example like we see right here in front of us, al-muttasilul isnad. And there's a science to this that you'll learn in grammar when the fa'il is being connected to its maf'ul, or the fi'l is being connected to its maf'ul. So the first of these types of hadith is that which has a connected chain. طيب, what does this connected chain require? بنقل عدل ضابط الفؤاد. It has to be connected via the transmission, meaning the people that are connecting the chain one to the next. Their transmission, those transmitters, they have to be adl. Adl, from the word adala, means, we translate it as righteous. But what is righteousness? Righteousness is a quality that carries a person to do what they've been commanded and avoid what they've been prohibited while observing proper etiquette. This is righteousness. And the author is going to define it later on in the book. But al-adala, if you want to understand what righteousness is, it's doing the obligations. The lowest level of righteousness is doing the obligations, avoiding the major sins, as well as persistency upon the minor sins. So a person does what they've been commanded, the obligations. They avoid that which they've been prohibited from major sins, and they're not persistent upon minor sins. In addition to observing proper etiquette and culture. So from the adala of a person is to observe the proper etiquette and culture that he is a part of. So the people who are transmitting the hadith, they have to have this quality of adala, righteousness. But righteousness by itself is not sufficient. In addition to righteousness, they have to be dhabit. They have to be precise. I.e., they have to have precision, al-fu'ad, in their intellect. Right? And what is precision? Precision is to preserve the information that you have received and being able to transmit it or relate it or relay it upon request. And precision is two types. Dhabtu sadr, precision in the heart. Like a person memorizes it, and then whenever they're requested to relay that information, they are able to relay it. That's precision in the heart, right? The location of thought and intelligence. The second type of precision is precision, dhabtul kitab, precision in the book. Meaning some people, their memory, la yusifuhum, it doesn't allow them to memorize very well. So they write their information down to preserve it. But in order for their transmission to be accepted in Sahih, they have to have dhabtul kitab, which is that they document the information accurately and preserve it from additions or tampering, whether it be additions or subtractions or changes, from the moment that they first wrote the information therein until the moment that they deliver it. And so if they wrote the information, but they documented it incorrectly, i.e. they wrote something wrong, or they wrote something unclear and they can't make out their writing, then this removes them from being precise in their book. Or if they documented the information accurately and adequately, but then allowed their book to be tampered with, they didn't guard it, they would loan it out to everyone, to where people could make alterations and adjustments and add and take out, and they weren't focused, or they weren't diligent in preserving the information therein, then they're not dhabitul kitab. Or if they preserved it but then lost their book, and so they weren't able to deliver from it upon request, like has happened to certain scholars, like Ibn Lahi'a, for example. He lost his books, and so his narrations became weak, not because he wasn't righteous, but because his source material was lost. So the chain for a hadith to be sahih, it has to have a connected chain via the transmission of righteous, yani adl, as well as precise individuals. When a person has these two qualities of righteousness and precision, we call them thiqah. That the person is thiqah. That's what thiqah means. He's reliable, i.e. he's righteous and precise. Some of the scholars, like al-Khattabi, for example, he doesn't mention precision. But the reality of it is that some of them, when they mention righteousness in hadith, they say that it includes precision. But it's better to separate between the two so that the student knows exactly what goes into being reliable. Righteousness as well as precision. And if the author would have said high levels of precision, it would have been better. Because as we'll learn, precision is of two categories. High levels of precision, which is necessary in a hadith that is sahih. For a hadith to be sahih, the person has to be of high levels of precision. And then you have precision that is lesser than that, which is the necessity for a hadith to be hasan. If somebody's precise, but not in the highest echelon of precision, then that person doesn't equate having a hadith that is sahih. That hadith will be hasan. And so you have to add to your recollection when we talk about a hadith that is sahih, righteousness, as well as the high levels of precision. And this type of transmission has to be from one person, one person who has these qualities to the next. So everybody in the isnad has to be of this nature. And that's why the author says, and mithlihi. The person that he's transmitting from has to be similar to him. Min ghayri ma shudhuthi. These three qualities, connectivity, righteousness, and precision, are the conditions of presence. These are the conditions that have to be present. Along with these three, there are two conditions that have to be negated. And this becomes important when we talk about how to define a hadith that is sahih, because we need to negate two things as well. We need to negate the hadith being contradictory, shadh. And we'll learn what shadh is later on. But in a nutshell, a hadith that is shadh is that which a person who is reliable and righteous, or precise and righteous, goes against somebody who's more precise. Or some group that is larger in number than him. When the precision seems to be in favor of someone other than that righteous, reliable person, and they have two statements that are opposed to each other, then we determine, generally speaking, that the one who has been outnumbered or overruled, his narration is shadh. And so for this reason, some of them remove from it the quality of being sahih. The reality, though, and Allah knows best, and we're going to talk about it, and this is applicable to both what is shadh and what has a damaging defect, is that it doesn't remove it from being sahih. A narration where somebody is righteous and reliable, or righteous and precise, but contradicts somebody more precise or some group larger in number, we don't determine that this first individual's information is now da'if. No, his information is still sahih. It's just that this other information is more sahih. And this is important to understand what is meant by that it's more sahih. Meaning, you can have two things that can be transmitted to us accurately to a large extent, but this information is more accurate. And for this reason, you find that the scholars of hadith like Bukhari and Muslim, they mention hadith in their book that are shadh. They mention a hadith that have subtle defects in them or damaging defects. But they still categorize the hadith as being sahih. And the benefit in this is that if there comes a way to combine them, or if we find more support for the one that we determined to be contradictory, it can change our view. So we don't determine that it's weak in reality. We just say that this is sahih, but this is more accurate. This is more actionable. But you'll still find it being mentioned in the books of hadith that deal with sahih. And likewise, a subtle defect or a damaging defect. And I keep saying subtle because a lot of them put that quality on as well, that the defect has to be a subtle hidden defect. Because if it's an obvious defect, then yes, the hadith is not authentic, right? If it's an obvious defect. And defects, as we're going to learn about, are a subtle defect, should I say, because the obvious defect is weakness, right? But a subtle defect could be somebody attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but it was really the statement of a sahabi. Or somebody connected the chain, but it was really a disconnected chain. So when you look at it, it seems to be authentic. But through your advanced study of hadith and your knowledge and awareness of it in totality, you're able to spot out those subtle hidden defects. Somebody said the person's name was this, but the person's name was actually something else. Like we just had an example the other day in the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba. Al-Muhriz Ibn Ka'nab is what the Isnad mentioned, but perhaps that person's actual name is Al-Ka'nab Ibn al-Muhriz Ibn al-Ka'nab, right? And so those subtle defects, sometimes they can be damaging, right? Like, for example, the person in the chain is mentioned in a way we don't know their identity. And their identity, we had it just recently in the hadith of Sufyan was narrating on, it was a person narrating on Sufyan, and it could have been, no, not Sufyan. Yahya ibn, not Yahya, it was Sa'd ibn somebody. It's escaping me right now. But there were two individuals, and it could be the reliable one or the unreliable one. I keep wanting to say Yasir ibn Sa'd. But there's two, one that's reliable and one that's weak. And we don't know which one it is because they shared the same teachers and they shared the same students, and this narration could be from either one of them, and the narrator doesn't define. And so in this circumstance, this is a subtle defect because I don't know who it is, but this subtle defect is damaging because it could be from the weak individual. While sometimes the subtle defect could be non-damaging. Like if I say Sufyan and a person doesn't know, is it Sufyan al-Thawri or Sufyan ibn Uyayna? Both of them are reliable. So that detail doesn't make a difference which one it is. So some of them say that the subtle defects, the subtle damaging defects, don't by themselves render the hadith inauthentic. but you have to look at the quality of the defect. And is it something that actually causes damage or not? Because you'll find a lot of times that there will be hadith that have subtle defects in them, but the people still use them. Like if the hadith has some instability in the chain, where multiple people are narrating in multiple different ways, they'll still use that hadith, even though that's a defect. But that defect, because they've determined what they believe to be the more accurate version, it's not damaging to them. And so in any circumstance, the things that are necessary for a sahih hadith is that it be a connected chain with righteous individuals who are extremely precise. And then we have to look as well to make sure that they're not contradicting anybody else who's more accurate, and there are no subtle flaws or defects that are damaging in the narration. When we do all of this, we're able to realize that this hadith has met the qualifications of being sahih. But when we say sahih, what does that mean? The author, he says, وَبِالصَّحِيحِ وَالضَّعِيفِ قَصَدُوا فِي ظَاهِرٍ لَلْقَبْ. When they say sahih and when they say da'if, their intention is only to relate what they see, what's apparent to them. And they're not talking about the reality of the matter. And this will bring us into two conversations. One of them is, if a scholar says sahih or da'if, does that mean that the hadith itself is sahih or da'if, or just that chain? Are they talking about just what they see in that chain, or are they talking about the hadith itself? And there's details in this that the author is going to mention later on in the book. So like if a scholar says this hadith is sahih, does he mean that what is being attributed to the prophet is sahih? Or does he mean, when just saying a general statement like that, that this chain is sahih? And there are details to this. Likewise, another issue, which is the more important of the two issues, is when something is sahih or da'if, you find that the people, they argue because of the human possibility of a righteous person making a mistake, or a person who's mistaken being accurate, or a liar telling the truth, or the possibility of a truthful person lying. And they say because of these possibilities, then a hadith in and of itself doesn't provide knowledge, or should we say certainty, al-qat, al-yaqeen. We're not 100% sure that this is what the Prophet ﷺ actually said. Or we're not 100% sure that the Prophet ﷺ didn't actually say this when we call something sahih or da'if. And this issue, ifadatul hadithi lil ilm, is a big issue, especially in the later generations. And so a lot of the people of fundamentals, they say, no, hadith don't benefit knowledge. You have no certainty via a hadith. And they say this is because a person could lie even though they're honest, and a person could be honest even though they were lying. And a person can be accurate even though they were known for being in error often. And a person can be in error even though they were known for being accurate often. And there are examples of this latter scenario all the time. Iblis told the truth, or shaitan sadaqaka wa huwa kadhub. Ibn Umar, he made mistakes in narrations. Ali, Ibn Abbas, Aisha, right? And so when you see that these mistakes are possible, they say hadith in and of themselves, they don't provide knowledge. They only provide ghalabatul dhann, a more preponderance of assumption, or a more likely assumption. It's most likely the case. And they say that all we can do is what we're able to. And so this is why we have to use hadith in spite of these possibilities, because all we can do is the best we can. And so this is one group of people. Another group of people, they say, no, hadith, they benefit knowledge. And this conversation of do hadith benefit knowledge or not is something that you all have introduced. And it didn't exist during the time of the Salaf. Instead, the Salaf, when a hadith came to them from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, sami'na wa ata'na. When the chain was reliable, they acted accordingly as if it was directly from the Prophet himself sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam support this concept. The Prophet would write letters or have letters written to people, and they would be expected to follow it. The Prophet would give commands to his emissaries, and the people would accept that information as being from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And none of them questioned, well, are you mistaken or did you lie even though you're honest? And a great example of this is the hadith of Qiblatain. The Sahaba knew to pray towards Bayt al-Maqdis by tawatur, by undeniable information. The first 16 months in Medina, there was no doubt that praying to Bayt al-Maqdis was wajib. And if somebody didn't do that, then their salat wouldn't have been accepted. And then, after Allah sent down that ayah in Surah Al-Baqarah, one of the Sahaba traveled to Quba, on the outskirts of Medina, and he found the people still praying towards Bayt al-Maqdis because they hadn't heard the ayah that had been revealed. So a situation that they knew with certainty, without doubt, that they should be praying to Bayt al-Maqdis. One man came to them and told them, I just prayed Asr with the Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we faced the Kaaba. We turned our direction towards the Kaaba. They didn't wait. They didn't verify his information. They didn't wait till more people came and told them. They abandoned something that they knew with certainty for the information of one person, claiming it or attributing it to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this shows us that the hadith provided these people knowledge enough to act according to it and to abandon something that was known with certainty that could be the cause of invalidating their prayer. And so this shows us how they approached the hadith. And so these are two sides of the argument. There's a third group that say that the hadith, they benefit knowledge when there are certain criteria that are met or certain secondary factors that go along with them. So not just any hadith benefits knowledge, but when certain factors are met, then those hadith benefit knowledge. And perhaps this is the strongest of opinions. And this is the view of Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, for example. And that is because sometimes you can have a hadith that's sahih, but as we mentioned, it might be shadh. It might have a defect. But when you put it through the whole process of the science of hadith, and other factors are added to it, like, for example, the hadith is muttafaqun alayh, or, for example, the hadith has certain things that it agrees with, or certain things from the Quran that support it, or something like this, then we say that this becomes known by certainty, and it provides knowledge. And so this is the conversation of about when somebody says that a hadith is sahih or da'if, they only mean what is apparent. That is the opinion of the people of usul. And they apply it in both situations, or what should I say? They apply it in the benefiting of knowledge through a hadith. They say you don't know for sure, but you do the best you can. But the reality of it is that a hadith, it provides knowledge when it's sahih. either in and of itself, which is the opinion of some, or when certain criteria and qualifications are reached, then it provides knowledge in and of itself. And like we said, the other portion of this topic that is also going, all of this is going to be talked about later on as well, is if a scholar says the hadith is sahih, how the hadith is sahih, do they mean that the chain is sahih, or do they mean that the entirety of the hadith is sahih? If they say sahih, hadithun sahih, or sahihul isnad, or they just say sahih, what is going on? Are they saying that the entirety of the hadith? Because you might find somebody saying, how the hadithun da'if? This hadith is da'if. But there's another version of it from somebody else that's sahih. And so when they say this hadith is da'if, are they referring to the chain only? Or they might just be referring to this particular chain, even though there's another chain on the same sahabi that's authentic. And so all of that will be discussed at due time, but we'll stop with this amount, inshallah. Hada wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala abdihi wa rasulihi nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. And like we say, one more time, let's go over the poem and ask yourself those questions about what we talked about from line to line. And then we'll hear with we'll listen to it, and we'll end our day with that. Al-Iraaqi rahimahullah ta'ala, he said, Aqsamul Hadith wa ahlu hadha sha'ni qassamu sunan ila sahihin wa da'ifin wa hasan. فالأول المتصل الإسناد بنقل عدل ضابط الفؤاد عن مثله من غير ما شذوذ وعلة قادحة فتوذي وبالصحيح والضعيف قصدوا في ظاهر للقطع والمعتمد. And that's where we're stopping for this week. One more time. وأهل هذا الشأن قسموا السنن إلى صحيح وضعيف وحسن فالأول المتصل الإسناد بنقل عدل ضابط الفؤاد عن مثله من غير ما شذوذ وعلة قادحة فتوذي وبالصحيح والضعيف قصدوا في ظاهر للقطع والمعتمد. And then let's hear those who sound much better than I do say it.
يكن لاثنين
أقسام الحديث.
وأهل هذا الشأن قسموا السنن إلى صحيح وضعيف وحسن فالأول المتصل الإسناد بنقل عدل ضابط الفؤاد عن مثله من غير ما شذوذ وعلة قادحة فتوذ وبالصحيح والضعيف قصدوا في ظاهر للقطع والمعتمد.
نعم. And so we'll suffice ourselves with this amount. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على عبده ورسوله نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Inshallah, later we'll pick up with the al-awsat. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.